that were built prior to that were considered pre-firm. In other words, they were built before there were any flood design standards in laws and regulations. In New York State, about 79% of the state's building stock was built before 1980. So this is statewide. So that gives you an idea of the percent of structures that were built before these standards were in place. 75% of the state's flood insurance policies are pre-firm, and of those 132,000, 65,000 of them are paying subsidized rates. Again, those are subsidized by other policyholders. And then I broke it into the flood zones in New York. Close to 2,000 policies are in these coastal V zones. 83,000 policies are in these A or AE zones. And 91,000 policies are what we call the B, C, or X zone. That's the 500-year flood zone, or even no flood risk designated. And I was surprised when I saw that number. The only way I can figure that out is that we've had a lot of new mapping, and up until now, people that are mapped into a flood zone have their flood insurance rates grandfathered. So they might be in a flood zone, they might be pre-firm, but they're paying an X zone rate or a preferred risk rate. A lot of that, frankly, is down in Long Island, where the flood zones got much larger in a few areas. So how you break that out into what people are paying, if you have a post-firm structure, it was built in accordance with those standards in place, the rates are actuarial. They're by law, they're set on an actuarial basis, which means that what you pay as a rate is supposed to reflect the actual risk of the structure. The higher you build the house, the lower your rate is going to be. As an example, if you have $100,000 in coverage and your lowest floor is 2 feet higher than that base flood elevation, your cost of that $100,000 in policy would be somewhere between $230 and $270 a year. That doesn't include contents coverage, which would be extra. Now, if you have a pre-firm structure, same situation, you're in a flood zone, the house was built in 1953, it's got a basement, was built before there were any standards for building in a flood zone, you're paying, at least until this law passed, you're paying a pre-firm rate. It's subsidized, but people are still paying over $1,000 a year, and they're complaining about it. But that rate is heavily subsidized by other ratepayers because that house is at much greater risk than the elevated house. And this is the scary figure. If that structure was based on an actuarial rate, and this is what FEMA estimates, that flood insurance risk-based rate can be as much as $9,000 a year. Within your flood zones, people who live in the V zones pay the highest, even if it's an actuarial-based rate. So if it's built to code, there's a lot of variables in it, but basically they're paying between $1,100 to $5,000 a year. And this is a house that's built to code. If it's pre-firm, a little bit higher than that. Because the actuarial cost is such a high risk in these V zones because of the wave action, that even when you build it to code, there's a lot of potential risk. You had a question?
This was the law that was passed last year, and so this is already in effect?
I'm sorry?
These rates and these changes are already in effect, or are they being phased in?
I'm going to get to that.
Okay.
So the rates that I'm showing you now are what has been in effect before the changes.